Joel chapter 2, verses 12 through 13 says, "Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning, and rend your hearts, not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and he relents over disaster." Scholars disagree on when Joel exactly was written, though the general consensus is what is called a post-exilic date. All that means is it was written in the time after the Jewish people were allowed to return from Babylon to the Promised Land by King Cyrus of Persia. And much of the imagery and language in the book of Joel makes sense in that setting, but I think that there is a strength to Joel's contextual ambiguity. See, Joel's message, what we've just heard, cannot be confined to a specific context. The message transcends its setting because as much as "yet even now" refers to a specific time and a specific place and a specific people, it nevertheless applies to any place and any time and any people. Because there is never a now where humanity is not just as prone to wander away from God as the people of Israel were. There is never a now where humanity's waywardness doesn't get them into trouble. And there is never a now where God, in his abundant mercy, does not call out, "Return to me." Today is Ash Wednesday, which is the first day of the Lenten season, the season of Lent. Lent is a season of what's called penitence, of repentance and of confession. And so Lent sounds this call of God to return into our now. The repeated call for return in Joel chapter 2, verses 12 through 13 carries two important implications for the Lent season: distance and relationship. What we mean by distance is that in our sin, in our sinfulness, we distance ourselves from the life and purposes of God. We have, as Luke says in the parable of the prodigal son, journeyed into the far country. We've squandered our inheritance in reckless living. And God will not allow us, his people, to get by with thinking that such sins are slip-ups or missteps, as we often dilute them, with no real consequence. Distance from God is dire. It is a sad and sorrowful life that is lived in separation from God. And so the road to return begins with fasting and with weeping and with mourning, the rending not just of our clothes, but with the innermost depths of our hearts as we recognize the severity of our sin. Lent begins in repentance because that is the only place it can begin. But we also said relationship. See, we do not just return from the far country, we return to the Lord, at whose side is, as Leslie Allen says in his commentary of Joel, the people's true habitat. Our true habitat, the place we were born to reside, is at God's side. And so God's call to return presupposes a relationship with him. We return to the Lord in confidence that he loves us, that he is merciful, he says, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And the Lord's words here are actually an echo of his promise to the Israelites at Mount Sinai after forgiving their construction of the golden calf, which they then worshiped. That's in Exodus chapter 32. And so that relates God's call given in our now to his work then to save them and to forgive his people. So however justified in his words and blameless in his judgment God is, his judgment is nonetheless, Allen continues, subordinate to the higher purpose of his people's welfare. God is judge, and God does pass judgment, but that is forever subordinate to his desire to be merciful to you and merciful to me. And so return does have judgment as its origin, but it has mercy as its end. See, Lent begins in repentance, but it ends in resurrection.